Driving south on 4th Street in Murray, Kentucky, you come upon a state historical marker. Since there's no place to park, it's easy to go on by. If you stop, you'll learn about the most famous person ever to come from Murray, Nathan Stubblefield. They got his middle name wrong. It's Beverly, like his grandfather, a veteran of the American Revolution. He didn't get any patents in 1892 either, but the part about wireless voice transmission is probably true. Across town on 16th Street, there's a small monument in front of the College of Business and Public Affairs at Murray State University, erected a few years after Nathan Stubblefield died. It refers to him as the inventor of radio and mentions experiments with broadcasting on his farm a short distance away from the monument site. And in a 19th century cemetery on the outskirts of Murray, the resting place of Nathan Stubblefield's mother's family, the Bowmans, we find his grave. The tombstone, erected nearly 25 years after he died, reads, "Inventor of wireless telephony or radio." Back in April 1928, here's what the New York Times said in his obituary. Radio pioneer dies, poor and embittered. Death has ended the dreams of Nathan Stubblefield, who in 1902 made great strides in what he called wireless telephony, and which has become radio. Mr. Stubblefield, who was 65, lived like a hermit in a small house in Callaway County. His wife and 5 children long ago left. In an interview in 1902, Mr. Stubblefield forecast radio and all its ramifications, including broadcasting, and declared he had solved the problem of sending the human voice through the earth, which he said he had started 10 years previous. He became a disappointed and disillusioned inventor.
Well, that is all well and good, except for one thing. I never called it radio. One good thing about being dead is you can learn for sure what people really think about you. Many folks have made claims about me since I died. Most more folklore than fact. The only person who knows the truth about Nathan Stubblefield is me. We Stubblefields are an old, large family in West Kentucky. My grandfather, Colonel Beverly Stubblefield, moved here from Virginia in 1825 to claim a 5,000-acre land grant given him for service in the Revolutionary War. 5 years later, my father, William Jefferson Stubblefield, was born. He read for law in Louisville and set up practice in Murray. He married Virginia Bowman, my mother. They had 4 sons. I'm the third, born 1860. Father led a Confederate regiment at Shiloh, came home in 1862 as Captain Billy. He contracted a lung infection during the battle that stayed with him all his life. Mother passed in 1869, and Father remarried Clara Janes, the family governess, a woman I never cared for. Then in 1874, Father passed away, and my brothers and I were orphans. I attended the local school and got high marks in penmanship and arithmetic, and I loved to draw. After Mother died, Father sent us to the boarding school at Farmington, where I met my future bride, Ada May. My formal education ended when Father died, and I returned to Murray to work on the farm, do odd jobs, and spend my time with my friend Duncan Holt. We spent hours at the Callaway County Times reading the periodicals. It was our private library. I loved farming, especially growing fruit and vegetables, and read everything I could find on the subject. But soon, my interest drifted to include the wonderful electrical inventions like the telegraph and the telephone. To my surprise, I found I understood how electrical circuits worked. I ordered some books on the subject and subscribed to Scientific American and Electrical World to learn more. Then an idea came to me. If I could become an inventor, like Thomas Edison or Alexander Graham Bell, my family would never want for anything. So I resolved to split my time between the farm and the new workshop I built in the house. My first invention was a device to light coal oil lamps without removing the chimney. I worked out details of the patent myself and received it in 1885. But I was fascinated with telephones and decided to build the first telephone system in Murray. To start, I bought copies of all Mr. Bell's patents. Soon I realized I could never afford to run the system and pay the franchise fee to use this equipment. But the patents began to expire in 1893, just a few years away. In the meantime, I could build a vibrating phone system without electricity that did not use any Bell patents, sign up customers, and be ready to convert it to electricity when I could avoid the patent royalties. So I built my own vibrating phones using oyster cans and waxed string, and got my second patent on that design in 1888, and sold the first phone to the county clerk and the next to Dr. Hart to connect his office with the drugstore downstairs. Before long, I had lines running to both drugstores in town from all the doctor's offices, to the depot and the newspaper, and to and from many satisfied business customers. I traveled to Tennessee and Mississippi to install Stubblefield telephones and had agents selling them in Illinois, Missouri, and points west. The next step was a new telephone design with an electric bell. I started installing those in 1890. They did not work any better than the original vibrating phone. However, they let me run the electric lines I would need a few years later. I was on my way. But a complication arose. By 1892, my family had grown to include 3 children, Bernard, Patty, and Victoria, and we lived on the acre I owned and farmed family land adjacent to it. Well, I approached my stepmother about my legacy from my father. He had set aside $1,000 for me to purchase a farm and $50 for the equipment to run it. She purchased the 85 acres that I was already farming, and I bought apple and pear trees to start an orchard. But the viper put the deed in the names of my children, so I could raise no money on it to continue my telephone business. Well, the best way ahead was to approach local businessmen, most of whom were already my customers, to invest in the company. So I had to divulge my plans. And this was my downfall. Dr. Hart got a group of men together, and they started their own telephone company. And within a year, I was out of business. Of course, the irony is they had to hire me to build it because I knew more about the system than anyone else in town. And I soon discovered something they did not know. While I was testing some telephones out in my shed, I noticed the wires were disconnected, but I was still hearing sounds. The phones worked without wires. They were pulling electricity out of the air. Well, it was the induction coils that made this work. I began some experiments. With a large coil of wire wound around trees in the orchard, I could send a voice to a small coil mounted in a nail keg and attached to a telephone receiver. One day in 1892, I surprised my young neighbor, Rainey Wells, by letting him be the first to hear how it worked. He took the nail keg phone out into the orchard, and when he got inside the large coil, I said, "Hello, Rainey." And then I learned something remarkable. A young man, when properly motivated, can jump 2 feet straight up from a standing start. Later I demonstrated it for Dr. Mason and several others, but I never told them how it worked. If I could perfect it, my wireless telephone could reach people beyond the wired bell network, and the phones would be portable. This time, I intended to wait until I was able to start the company myself. I encountered problems. Try as I might, I never could get a useful signal more than a few yards from the large coil. I needed more distance. I tried increasing power with more batteries, but only succeeded in burning up the equipment. I even designed my own battery, one that produced power from the earth when I buried it. This earth cell battery became my third patent in 1898, and it taught me something. I could make a wireless telephone work through the ground and achieve the distance I needed. Bernard was now old enough to help, so I did not need to let anyone outside the family know what I was doing. From this point on, I decided to restrict access to my workshop and property, a hardship my wife and family had to accept if I was to be successful. From time to time, I would carry my apparatus to town on Saturday when we sold produce at the Courthouse Square Market. Bernard brought his harmonica, and he would play notes or count or recite something while I listened. This drew a curious crowd, and finally I was ready for a public demonstration. I sent notices to the newspapers about the special event on New Year's Day, 1902. We set up a transmitter on the courthouse lawn and placed 5 receivers at locations around town, some several blocks away. At each listening point, people could clearly hear Bernard and me talk and play music. The next day, newspapers across Kentucky carried accounts of the event, and within a few days, a reporter from St. Louis came down for an exclusive story. I took him out to the farm, showed him the equipment, and demonstrated how he could hear a signal nearly a mile away from the transmitter. What Marconi had done with telegraph through the air a month earlier, I was accomplishing with telephone through the earth. I explained the capability of my wireless telephone system to send signals from one transmitter to several receivers simultaneously. This was a flaw in the design, which I needed to correct so each telephone call could be private. But I remarked that the feature could be eventually used to transmit weather information and news over a wide area. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch story brought me much publicity, and I decided to take my invention to Washington in March to demonstrate it for the patent office personnel and other people. I staged a number of demonstrations there over several days, even rented a boat to transmit a wireless telephone call through the water and the earth to shore. Sometimes I had to add more batteries to get a good signal. The East Coast newspapers and several periodicals, even Scientific American, picked up the story, and I soon had an offer of substantial financial support. Gerald Fennell contacted me about my invention. Word of Marconi's success had spread, and the possibility of a wireless telephone system interested him and his partners. They wanted to form the Wireless Telephone Company of America to develop my system. They already had a client, a small telephone system on an island off the coast of South Carolina. Fennell offered me 500,000 shares of stock in the company, funds to build more powerful transmitter, and the chance to travel to Philadelphia and New York to demonstrate the invention. Well, after talking the matter over with friends back in Murray, I accepted, and many of them decided to buy stock in the new company. Well, it was a time to celebrate. I invited friends and investors out to the farm for an afternoon of food and demonstrations. Old Sam played the banjo, and everybody could hear him through the telephone. I hired a photographer and carefully arranged the wireless telephone, the earth cell battery, photographs of the Washington events, equipment of my workshops, and copies of the books and periodicals I used in my research so they would appear in the photographs. I wanted to promote the farm as well. Since it was early April, there were no leaves or fruit on the trees. I got a few bushels of apples from storage and had the boys climb up and tie them on the trees so they would be in the picture. Bernard and I began to work on the improved system. By late May, it was ready. The company arranged a demonstration at Fairmount Park in Philadelphia on Decoration Day, and everything was a big success. I met Edwin Houston, one of Edison's partners in General Electric, and Frederick Collins, an inventor who was working on similar wireless telephone equipment. Then we were off to New York for an early June event in Battery Park. The company made all the arrangements, publicized the demonstrations widely, and invited many potential investors. I knew the first time we stuck the rods in the ground that we were in trouble. The soil in Battery Park is very rocky, and we could not get a good earth connection. It was only a few blocks from Edison's main generating station, and there were so many grounded electrical circuits that when you did get a connection, you could barely hear it all for the noise in the circuit. I told Fennell to move somewhere else, but he said it had to be Battery Park because it was so close to the bankers on Wall Street. He told me to bury a hidden wire to complete the circuit. No one would know. But I knew. I knew right then Bernard and I were in the midst of a gang of thieves and were parties to a deception perpetrated on some of my friends back home. We had no choice. We had to leave New York, come home. My invention, my patents, my future in the telephone business were all the property of the Wireless Telephone Company of America, sold for shares of worthless stock. I could not even apply for a patent on it. But that devil Collins took my ideas and got one a few years later. My trunk with all the equipment stayed there while Bernard and I headed back to the farm. My only chance now lay in returning to experiments with the induction coil system. Somehow, I had to make it work at a greater distance. I erected a large coil suspended on a pole back in the orchard and built a portable receiver in a box. Bernard and now Patty and Victoria helped me and kept careful notes of the experiments. We made it work at slightly more than a quarter mile, and I judged that to be enough to send a signal from a moving train, boat, or stagecoach to and from a coil suspended above the thoroughfare. In 1907, I filed for my 4th patent, and the first for a wireless telephone. But none of this mattered. I never raised enough money to develop the idea. Working on the patent had taken me away from the farm so much it was no longer doing well. I tried running a school for a few years, but it, too, was a failure. There were now 6 children, and they got tired of not having any friends or new clothes or even being able to go to church or town. But I could not let them circulate until the patent protected my ideas. Nathan and Oliver both left, and Bernard, Patty, and Victoria sold the farm out from under me. Ada stayed with me until Helen, the youngest, got married. Then she returned to her family in Paducah. For the first time in my life, I was alone. I tried to find work in Washington, but ended up back home, where Carl Crisp let me set up camp out at his place in Van Cleve. There was an old tenant house on the farm that he let me use. It was dug into the side of a hill and had a dirt floor, but that did not bother me. I put black tobacco canvas on the roof to gather the sunshine, heat the house in the winter. I could bury earth cell batteries in the ground right in the house and continue my experiments, but I had so little equipment I had to take something apart in order to build anything new. So I made scant progress. Every now and then I pulled a prank on my neighbors, like the time I hid a telephone transmitter in a fence row and told one of them to keep his cow out of my garden. And I had one woman convinced that I could make a whole hillside light up. I could have too, if I just had enough time, money, and equipment. I raised a small garden, enough to sustain me and barter with the neighbors for milk and fresh meat, and a cat took up with me, kept the rats away. My cousin, Vernon Stubblefield, looked in on me from time to time. Vernon always brought a bag of groceries and lent me a little money now and then, but I always gave him an IOU. I wrote to the children, but they never wrote back. I always told Vernon he was the best boy I had. It was Vernon who started talking about the radio, a new thing, in 1925. He was convinced I had something to do with it and kept at me until I started giving him photographs, articles, documents, things about my experiment. I tried to tell him I knew nothing about it, but once I gave him an article about the earth cell battery and scribbled a note on it that if I made any contribution to radio, this was it. I hated to disappoint that boy. Near the end, in the spring of 1928, I told my neighbor Obed Daniel that if he didn't see any smoke from my place for a day or two, he ought to check on me. And then it happened. I was walking across the floor one morning and my feet just came out from under me. I lay there on the floor and the old cat came over and began licking my face, trying to get me to get up and feed him. But I just lay there. The earth was cool and fresh. Pretty soon, I could feel the electricity coming up out of it. And then I was gone. They found me 2 days later and buried me in an unmarked grave.
Later that year, the new Murray State Normal School hired L.J. Horton, a young newspaper reporter from St. Louis, to teach journalism. Horton wanted his students to cover real news. Rainey Wells, who was president of Murray State at the time, told Horton the story of Nathan Stubblefield and introduced him to Nathan's cousin Vernon, who provided more information. Soon Horton and his students were writing stories about Stubblefield and selling them to the Associated Press and other news agencies. It was L.J. Horton who first called Murray, Kentucky, the birthplace of radio. The Chamber of Commerce, the Rotary Club, and the Daughters of the Confederacy took up the cause to have Stubblefield and not Marconi recognized as the true inventor of radio. When Murray got its first radio station in 1948, the owners used the call letters WNBS for Nathan B. Stubblefield. At the Chamber of Commerce, James Johnson continued the campaign and negotiated proclamations from the Kentucky Broadcasters Association and the Governor of Kentucky, naming Murray the birthplace of radio. Along the way, there have been numerous articles, radio plays, and books. Stubblefield has been the subject of newspaper cartoons, a commemorative stage musical, theses and dissertations, and a television documentary. Radio station WNBS is still on the air, and the city of Murray continued to use the phrase birthplace of radio until the late 1990s. Despite all the effort over the years, the promotional campaign on behalf of Nathan Stubblefield has convinced few people outside of Murray that he invented radio. But now, as we approach the centennial of Nathan Stubblefield's wireless telephone patent, the consumer electronics industry is taking a new look at the electromagnetic induction wireless communication he used. It is the basic technology that makes near-field communications work. This allows people to make quick, secure, wireless connections between two devices so you can use your mobile telephone as an electronic wallet. Perhaps Nathan Stubblefield really was ahead of his time.
As I look back, I recall 2 lines from a poem, The Inventor and the Crank, written in 1886 by the man with the irony pen. Yours truly, Nathan Stubblefield. Sad, sad was the life of the old-time wizard. His life must have been one continuous blizzard.